All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating article called The Fog of Power, How Ambiguity Expands Authority. And it makes a pretty bold claim about the connection between the words we use, the laws we make, and who holds the power.
So, let's kick things off with a central question. What in the world could possibly connect the American Revolution way back in the 18th century with all the complex rules and regulations we navigate today? I mean, they seem like two completely different universes, right?
Well, what this article argues is that the link is a single, incredibly powerful weapon that's been used for centuries: ambiguity. The author's point is that vague, fuzzy language isn't just an accident or a mistake in a law, it's often a deliberate feature. It's a tool for expanding power.
And that gets us to the core idea of the piece, what it calls power's shelter. The central argument here is that people in power know that unclear terms create flexible limits. You know, when a rule is vague, it lets whoever's in charge stretch its meaning to fit whatever they need, all while kind of protecting them from being held accountable.
Now, to really build this case, the article says we have to rewind the clock. It argues that the American Revolution wasn't just a fight over taxes or tea. At its heart, it was a revolution for clarity, a massive pushback against undefined, limitless authority.
And you can actually see this battle against ambiguity playing out in real time on this timeline. It starts in 1766, when the British Parliament passes something called the Declaratory Act. Fast forward a couple of decades, and you have the Brutus essays ringing the alarm bell about vague language in the new U.S. Constitution. This directly leads to James Madison's famous push for few and defined powers, which gets locked in with the 10th Amendment, a direct attempt to draw a clear line in the sand.
Now, what's really wild here is the exact phrasing. The Declaratory Act gave Britain the power to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Just think about that phrase for a second. In all cases whatsoever. There's no limit. The article pinpoints this specific open-ended language as the trigger for the revolution, because it was basically a blank check for absolute power.
And you know that fear? It didn't just disappear. As the U.S. Constitution was being debated, an anti-federalist writer using the name Brutus warned that some of the elastic clauses in the document could be twisted to give Congress absolute and uncontrollable power. The worry was that the government could just redefine its own authority whenever it felt like it.
And this is the perfect illustration of the counterargument. James Madison, one of the main architects of the Constitution, came right back at those fears. In Federalist No. 45, he promised everyone that the new federal government's powers were few and defined, and that everything else was left to the states. This just shows that the core debate at the nation's founding was really over the clarity of its most important words.
Okay, so after laying out all that history, the article pivots and brings us right into the present day. The argument is that the exact same dynamic is happening now, just with a whole new set of what it calls elastic terms. To make its modern case, the source hones in on two specific examples: the terms hate speech and gender. Now, it's really crucial to understand that the article presents these as its own chosen case studies, examples of modern, expandable categories that it argues are being used to grow regulatory authority.
So let's take a look at the first one. The article points out that here in the U.S., hate speech doesn't actually have a single fixed legal definition. Then it contrasts that with countries like Canada and Scotland, which do have specific laws against it. The author's point here is to show that in those places, the official definitions of what counts have tended to grow broader over time.
Next, the article lays out its specific account of the term gender to support its thesis. It traces this four-step path. It started, it says, as a simple term in grammar. Then, it claims it was applied to people by psychologist John Money. From there, it was adopted by academia and policymakers as this flexible, changeable identity category. And in the author's view, this evolution was then used to expand legal rules. And it points to New York's gender law as a prime example.
So this all begs a huge question, right? Why does this strategy work? Why, according to this article, does vagueness so often win out in the end? This next part explores the mechanics of how this ambiguous language lets power grow, and sometimes grow very, very quickly.
The source gives this process a name: the acceleration effect, and it breaks it down into three simple steps. First, an agency or some other bureaucratic body just acts, using a vague term as its green light. Step 2, they define the term after they've already taken the action, basically writing the rule to justify what they already did. And third, that successful power grab sets a new precedent, which becomes the new starting line for the next expansion.
And this is where the author says the real danger lies. The argument is that this whole effect completely flips the constitutional order upside down.
Instead of powers being granted first by the people through law and then being used, this process sees powers being used first and then justified later. It's a total reversal.
So where does all this leave us? Well, it brings us to the article's really powerful conclusion, which it frames as a conflict taking place on what it calls the battleground of language.
And here it is. The final takeaway from this source is simple but incredibly potent. The first, and maybe the most important, fight in governing is the fight over what words mean. The argument is that if language itself can be made fluid and imprecise, well, then the laws and the constitutional limits that are built on that language become just as fluid and just as imprecise.
And so we're left with one heck of a question to think about, one that ties everything together, from that Declaratory Act in 1766 all the way to our policy debates today. When does a word stop being just a description of something and start being a tool to change it? That's a powerful thought to chew on.